siguiente presentación, la última presentación de las jornadas, en este caso será impartida en inglés y hablando sobre la competencia y la inteligencia artificial. En este caso, if you don't mind, let me switch to English just to introduce Dr. Trivol Schreppel, one of the most prominent voices in the field of digital antitrust and competition policy. Dr. Schreppel is a faculty affiliate at Stanford University Codex Center and an associate professor at VU Amsterdam. He also holds research and teaching positions at the University Paris 1, Pantheon, Sorbonne, and Sciences Po Paris. He received the Global Competition Review Award for Academic Excellence, recognizing his outstanding contribution to competition policy. His work explores how technologies such as blockchain and AI interacts with competition law. Since 2022, the Catalan Competition Authority has had the privilege of collaborating with Dr. Schreppel through the Stanford Computational Antitrust Project. We are deeply grateful for Dr. Schreppel's leadership and inspiration and in this global effort to connect technology and competition enforcement. So without further ado, let me now give the floor to Dr. Schreppel. A pleasure. I will look for it, yeah. All yours. Thank you very much.
So in the next 30 minutes, I want to talk about free jazz. But before I do so, I want to thank the organizers very much for having me. I'm absolutely delighted to be in such a beautiful venue. The atmosphere is very friendly. And the discussions, for what I could understand, were also fascinating. So thank you so very much. And again, before I talk about free jazz, there is actually a little video that I want to show you.
Esto no es exactamente cierto porque también hablaré sobre música clásica. Ahora, tengo que disculparme por dar mi presentación en inglés. Y como pueden imaginar, este es, por supuesto, un video generado por IA, el tema de mi charla de hoy. Bien, te devuelvo la palabra, Thibaut.
All right. So indeed, I want to talk about free jazz and classical music. Now, why is that? Because I think it actually helps to create some perspective on the subject of AI and competition policy. On the one hand, you hear that in the space of AI, competition policy will be something similar to classical music where you do have one conductor that is orchestrating the whole orchestra, allegedly for his or her own purpose. And translated to AI and competition policy, this is the view according to which you have a couple powerful big tech companies, and all they are doing is fine-tuning the market in a way that will end up benefiting their own interests. Okay, that's one side of the spectrum. On the other side of the spectrum, you have free jazz. And by the way, this is a great album with a bit of Spanish music in it. So you may be interested in listening to that one. But the view translated to competition policy is that it's all very dynamic, it's all very chaotic. We see a lot of competition in AI. It's impossible to predict what's coming next. So the last thing that competition agencies should do is to actually invite me today to talk about AI, because they must have other priorities, right? Now, those are two very extreme views. And when it comes to AI specifically, but generally speaking with competition policy, for every complex problem, you find an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. And I think if you take one of those two approaches when it comes to AI, you will get something that is very clear, very simple, and probably very wrong. So my point today is to confuse you and explain why indeed no answer can be clear, simple, and hopefully leads to some truth. So here's one representation of the AI stack. On the previous panel, you had a different one. I'm not specifically attached to this one, but at least it helps to get a view as to what are the different layers when we talk about AI and generative AI. At the very bottom, you have the AI infrastructure. I've put here the logos of a couple companies. You're all familiar, at least with NVIDIA and AWS, that's Amazon Cloud. ASML, quite a big and large Dutch company, is also playing a key role in manufacturing the chips, right? So without access to what those companies are providing you with, you are guaranteed you're not going to have any AI. If you get access to that, you have the foundation models. And the companies providing you with foundation models are OpenAI, Mistral, Anthropic, Google, and a couple others, right? There are actually way more, and I will come back to this point a bit later on. Those foundation models is something that you are using in case you are indeed interacting with an AI system at the application layer. That's the third one over here. So you may be familiar with ChatGPT. To be very French here, you may also want to try Le Chat, Mistral, and again, there's a couple of competitors out there, right? And on top of that, you have users that put happy faces, but of course, it doesn't have to be happy faces. It could also be that it would lead to very serious mental health issues. But that's pretty much the AI stack. Now, what I see in the space, and I'm trying to survey all of what competition agencies are doing. So if you just Google, or you don't have to use Google, antitrust initiative targeting AI system, you will find this database in which, again, I'm trying to track everything that competition agencies are doing in the space. Now, looking at the geographic distribution, you see that the United States is actually the most active, which is quite interesting when you hear that Europe is over-regulating, but the US is also very interested in those issues. The United Kingdom, the European Union, and you see that there are other jurisdictions. So it's a clearly global phenomenon. Now, if you consider what they've been doing since the advent of ChatGPT, November 2022, starting in then 2023, you see that the very first step was for competition agencies to publish market studies and understand the market, which I would argue is excellent. Moving forward to 2024, you see that competition agencies are starting to focus on AI investments, acqui-hires, and other partnerships that do not necessarily take the form of merger control, but may raise related issues. And back to 2025, you see that competition agencies are starting enforcement in the space, and for the most part, they focus on the structure of the market as being the key issue that they wish to tackle, right? So related to Article 102 of the TFEU and the equivalent. Now, what I hope to see in 2026 is that when they do so, competition agencies, to come back to the little graphic over here, will consider not just one layer at the time, but the interaction between those layers. And I want to explain why I think this is especially important. If you consider, and this was already mentioned this morning, a company or foundation model such as DeepSeek, what's very interesting in the development of this model, that you can access, by the way, here in Europe as well, is that the architecture of the model is very different than the architecture of GPT-5 or ChatGPT. I don't want to be too technical, but in a nutshell, what's happening with DeepSeek, when you prompt the system, what you do not see is that the system will actually generate several branches of possible answers and will quickly enough evaluate which one is the most promising. Once the choice has been made that this branch is the most promising in giving you an answer to your prompt, the system will then only function and look at the data that is related to that specific branch. The result is that instead of having a model that will try to gather all the information in the data set, DeepSeek only utilizes the information that is related to the branch that has been chosen to be the most effective. And as a result of that, you see that the cost, according to them, to train their model was about 5 million compared to GPT-5. We don't have official numbers, but apparently we passed $1 billion US. And if you look at the chips and the compute that was needed indeed to train the model, in the case of DeepSeek, they reported using 2,000 GPUs provided by NVIDIA. And in comparison, for the purpose of training GPT 4.5, the company used in between 30,000 and 80,000, right? So we compare, again, 2 versus 80,000 chips. Now, what's quite interesting is that reportedly, for the purpose of training GPT-5, OpenAI used less chips than was necessary for them to train GPT 4.5. So you see that, again, within the big companies, there is a change in the architecture and in the compute that they must access. So that's a good example of how the training of the foundation model and the technique that you use will actually require and lead to different needs when it comes to access to AI infrastructure, right? So when you consider AI infrastructure and the concentration that is clearly happening at that level, the architecture on top of it has a role in the analysis. I'll take another example. That's one of a technical paper published in October of 2025, so just about a month ago. Again, I don't want to bore you with the technical details, but what you see is that there is a new technology, and it's all the fuzz now on social media, so I'm told this must be real. You see that there is what they call tiny recursive models. Basically, what's happening is that the data set is much smaller than for the large models such as GPT-5. In fact, here it is 10,000 times smaller than the large data sets. And what's happening is that the model will generate a first draft of an answer to your prompt, will then ask itself the question, is it good enough? And will do that in the form of feedback loop up to 16 times. Now, you may think that doing that is actually very costly because you need to access a lot of compute power. But in fact, because the original data set is 10,000 times smaller, you still see that it is way more effective to have a model function this way than to have it function in just one go, where you generate a word and guess what's the most likely words to come next, which is the way OpenAI functions. So those are technical explanations showing that, again, the way you train the model and the way it performs once it is put out there on the market will actually change the needs you have to access compute. So far, to go back to my classical music versus free jazz, I've been giving you the story of free jazz, right? The story is that, yes, you have dominant position, especially at the AI infrastructure layer, but it's not such a big deal because architectures are evolving in a way so that you need less and less access to compute, or at least you need less access to compute to produce a similar model. And you see that this week, a Chinese model, Kimi K2, was released. It is, again, way smaller than the other big models, and this one performs better than GPT-5. So there is clearly a story of free jazz behind my explanation. But I want to introduce some more classical music into the mix, considering this time not the interaction between the AI infrastructure and the foundation models, but the interactions between the foundation models and the apps on top, such as chatbots, such as generating videos, including the one that I just showed you this morning. And what you see here, and as you all have competition expertise, you're going to see many competition issues popping up in the next coming minutes. Companies such as OpenAI, and it's not the only one, but I'm just taking this one as an example, have been, in the last 2 years, trying to create an ecosystem around their foundation models by enabling people to download specific GPTs. You can think of it as an application that functions on top of a foundation model, right? So they announced the GPT store, where, and you could still do it to this day, if you use GPT-5, you go to the left part of your screen, and then you could see specific GPTs that are developed by specific companies. And so if you select them, you could say, well, I want to generate pictures in a way that corresponds to what Canva, a company that you can use to generate pictures, is providing me with, right? So you can download those very specific GPTs, and the hope is that if you interact with GPT-5 within a specific GPT, it will actually give you better answers than if you were to interact with the general model, right? So that has been OpenAI's strategy to try to create an ecosystem and hopefully lock in the user or increase market shares. And this was quite effective. It's a bit blurry, but basically you see that this was a large success. Now, the problem is that if you do so, what you require is that every app developer has to develop something that is very specific to your foundation model. So it may work if you are the largest, but as we know, network effects, especially at the very beginning, are very hard to generate. you have a bootstrapping problem, and so you are not guaranteed that you're going to reach the tipping point after which everyone's going to want to develop a specific GPT. So that's a risky business strategy, especially if you have free jazz in a competitive environment. So OpenAI and other companies switched strategy, and this is something that happened within the last 2 months. What you see now is that instead of having the GPTs, they are relying on an open source technology. And that's something that sometimes when I read online discussions, I see some confusion about the fact that it's not because you use an open source technology that you are guaranteed you're going to see competition. If you utilize an open source technology within a closed system, you may also recreate some competitive issues within the system. And this is certainly what OpenAI is trying to do, using something called MCP, that is a technology that has been developed by OpenAI competitor, Anthropic. It's also a very large player. And basically what you can do with an MCP is to create an AI agent. I'll give you the short version. Instead of asking app developers to develop something specific for your foundation model, what you can simply do is to link a service that exists already to your foundation model without any need for a specific development to your foundation model, right? This is, again, something that Anthropic developed, and OpenAI is now doing that. What's the result of it? Well, the result is all of this, and those are screenshots that I took within the last month. So this is moving really fast, as we know, and probably even faster than what we often think. So what you see is now companies such as PayPal, Shopify, here you have Walmart, the one over here is Etsy. They enable you to act within GPT-5 without ever leaving the ecosystem and interact with their businesses. And again, as we know, Walmart is not specifically developed for the purpose of functioning on top of GPT-5, and yet it functions. So the goal here is to keep users within your ecosystem. And here I'll show you a demo of how it looks like, knowing that this is something that functions already. So this is not science fiction and very futuristic. So what you see here is that the system was prompted to find a gift for a friend, and automatically within, again, ChatGPT, without ever going to Etsy, the transaction was completed, and you hopefully will receive the good. Now, there are different ways for you to do that, and you could try it for yourself. You could tell to the system, okay, I'm in Barcelona, I want to find a gift that relates to my trip over here. Please give me a couple options, and the system will find those options for you and will leave you the choice to actually select. Or you could automate the whole chain of interactions and say, as long as it's below 100 euros and the colors are whatever may please my friends, I want you to automate the whole transaction, and the system will then buy access to your wallet through Stripe or PayPal and complete the transaction, right? Which, as competition lawyers, of course, you see all the issues that may surround the use of such a system. So that's interesting because if you think and take a step back and think about what it means compared to the big tech era of the 2010s, what those companies have been doing is that they clearly intermediated transactions between two sides or more sides of the market, right? And in a sense, what those generative AI companies are trying to do is to erase intermediaries, because for now, you can see that you are buying a product from Etsy, but it doesn't have to be, right? The whole thing could be fully automated and transparent, and OpenAI may have market power that is good enough to tell all the companies, you can plug your service to me. It's not going to be shown to users, but at least you have a transaction, so you should be happy with it. So intermediaries are being erased, and certainly this is at least the direction that we are seeing within the last couple of weeks. So what does it mean for my free jazz to classical music spectrum? Well, here you see that jazz is actually not so free. Because if I've been doing transactions within ChatGPT, it knows my preferences. The more users, the more the Walmart and Etsy and online stores of this world have an interest in plugging their businesses to ChatGPT and not another one necessarily. And so you see that there is clearly a reinforcing effect and potentially market dominance. To come back to this slide that I skipped, and I just wanted to mention that because this is of importance, you have a platform called Hugging Face that is freely accessible to all of you right now. And as you can see, they say, which is true, that on that platform, you can actually download more than 1 million foundation models, okay? Now, we don't really have the time, but if I were to ask in the room whoever downloaded one of those foundation models and who is running locally that foundation model instead of using OpenAI, it's clearly not the majority in the room, right? So we have plenty of options, and yet we are already aggregating toward a couple foundation models. And with this kind of strategy, it seems that we're going to aggregate toward a couple foundation models, at least have an oligopoly market, if not a more concentrated market. So now the question is, okay, so all of that is good, but so what do we do? So what does it mean for competition agencies and for practitioners? And I think here there are 3 things that in 2025 we can already do, and I understand that the critic of competition agencies in telling them you've been too static is a bit of an easy critic, because when you face a case, and all of you pretty much are practitioners, you know that better than I do, you have to come up with concrete answers, right? You cannot simply guess that, well, I think the market will evolve that way and use that in a case. It's not very persuasive. However, I believe that there are concepts that we can use in 2025 that are tangible, that you can measure, and that inherently will capture the dynamics of the ecosystem. And the first one is the concept of increasing returns. So you have a lot of literature on the concept. It started being formalized with Keen Harrow, the Nobel Prize, and then Brian Arthur and a couple others. Basically, the idea is that the more you produce, the cheaper it becomes per unit to produce the goods, which is a dynamic that, as we know, you see online, right? The more you have users, the cheaper per user it becomes to attract new users, because once you have the infrastructure, the marginal cost is constantly decreasing. What's quite interesting, and so one of the types of those increasing returns are network effects, but you have other ones, economies of scope, scale, and a couple others, right? But let's think about network effects. Not all network effects are born equal. And this is something that I tend not to see in actual cases. You may have a distinction between 2 types of network effect. It may be that because you benefit from network effect, your ecosystem is actually more robust than an ecosystem without network effect. And immediately we think social media, right? It's pretty much guaranteed that Instagram won't go to 0 user in the next 2 months. It's not impossible, but it's very unlikely, okay? So in that sense, those network effects are making Facebook ecosystem more robust and the market shares more solid. But it could also be the opposite. It could be that a network effect is actually very much subject to fashion and trends. And you certainly see that with music and artists, where you may actually attract millions of users on Spotify, but after a couple weeks, you're not fashionable anymore, and therefore all the users will shift to another product, right? So in that sense, because you have network effect, your market shares are very fragile. So that's the first distinction. But there's another one here on the screen, which is a distinction between the network effect that benefits the users, and immediately we think consumer welfare standard or any other standard that you may want to deploy in competition analysis. The point I want to make is that if you see that increasing returns and specifically network effect end up benefiting user by increasing the quality of the product, then it's a complicated story to say that we have a competition problem, right? Because then eventually, even if it decreases competitive pressure, you have to do a balancing act or use another legality test. But you see that the Court of Justice is not very willing to do that. Some network effects, however, are putting you in a position as the company that benefits from them to actually increase market shares, and yet they are not necessarily passed on consumers and do not increase the quality of the product. It may be that, for instance, it benefits the reputation of your company, which is very good for the company and will give you bargaining power in negotiation strategies, but that does not necessarily directly benefit the consumers. So this kind of network effect, you could say, well, those are more suspicious because they will lead to entrenched market positions and users won't necessarily benefit from them. It seems to me that we could definitely deploy this kind of analysis in competition cases. So that's the first target for practitioners and competition agencies, asking which kind of network effect do we see in the AI stack, and is it leading to a better layer or is it not? The second thing that we can consider is the use of dynamic competition analysis or complexity economics. And here I know I've put a lot of information on the screen, so I will take a couple minutes to show you that if you deploy a traditional antitrust analysis, we'll already get a sense, at least I do get a sense, that answering those questions is actually really hard, if not uncomfortable. So let's look at the left part of the screen. If you go back and take in mind my example of OpenAI trying to integrate the whole transaction chain, right? If I ask you what is the relevant market, already that's a difficult one. And you see that being translated somehow in the actual AI Act, where the Commission first introduced a risk-based approach, meaning where do you deploy an AI system? And when ChatGPT appears, the risk-based approach doesn't make sense anymore because you can use ChatGPT to generate poem, to grade student essay, just saying, or to draft conclusions before a judge, right? So then suddenly you have to deploy another approach, which is to say we're not going to look at the reason why an AI system was created. If it can be used for many different purposes, we're going to look at the capacity of the AI model, which is why you have a new chapter in the AI Act. And back to competition law already, that puts you in a very difficult position if you want to define the relevant market of GPT-5. What's the geographical market? Maybe that one is easier, but the product market is extremely hard to define. Second question, are there substitutes? So in the example that I just showed you, what do you consider to be a substitute? Do you consider Amazon to be a substitute? Well, they apparently think it is, because it looks like Amazon is trying to prevent you to use AI-powered browser in order to automate transactions on the Amazon platform. But is that good enough for you to go through all the steps of computational analysis? That's a difficult one. Do we see that OpenAI holds a dominant position once you've defined the market? Again, not easy to measure. Is the firm favoring its own products? And in the case of big tech companies, this analysis we can do with Google and Google Shopping. But in the case of here, OpenAI and Etsy and Walmart, maybe contractual terms could be complicated, but it's not something that you can observe from the outside. I go on the list. Does the conduct reduce short-term output or raise prices? Again, not easy to answer. And can we restore fair competition by imposing neutrality, interoperability? Again, that would require a very technical analysis. If you say and force OpenAI to open that whole chain of transaction to other companies that are not necessarily willing to be part of the ecosystem, you see that those are complicated questions to answer. If we have more of a complexity-minded approach, and by that I mean if we consider all the interactions between the layers, we get to very different questions, but those, I think, can be answered by competition lawyers and economists. First answer, what is the speed at which the market leaders are pulling away from or being caught by the actual rivals, right? This is more dynamic in nature. Second question, at what point do we see that the feedback loops, they become irreversibly self-reinforcing? That's also something that we can measure. I will tell you how on the next slide. Do we see that marginal value of additional data that decline fast enough for competitors to be able to catch up with the large players? And I could go on and on the list. You see that those are the questions that are not easy to answer, but answerable, because you, again, consider the interactions between all the different layers of the AI stack. The last thing that I wanted to show you is this. So that's the use of computational tools, including AI, by competition agencies. And I'm very comfortable in telling you about this, because the Spanish competition agency and the Catalan competition agency are certainly leaders in the space. So it's a very good way, an appropriate place for me to talk about it. So here what I've done is that I've listed different computational techniques or tools that you can actually deploy in order to get to an answer related to the question that I just showed you. So let's go again through the list. Network analysis, so think, you may have seen that, those networks, they usually look quite beautiful, where you have nodes and you have edges between the nodes. The nodes could be competition decisions and you see how they are related, or in the case of here generative AI, what you can do is actually measure the centrality of the network. So you could see how a product or a company is central by mapping all of the nodes with all the companies and all the services. This can be automated, and if you are to do that on, let's say, a weekly basis, you could see the whole network evolving, and measuring the centrality of the network may actually give you to a first answer when it comes to market shares and market positions. 2, natural language processing. So it's AI that is deployed and applied to language. What you could do here is to detect what is called sentiment analysis. So it's a bit about, the sentiment as we use it in the daily life. And certainly, if you were to look at forums, and all of the big AI players, they all have forums where you see that a lot of developers, they exchange ideas. You could actually measure if they talk about switching experiences and try to measure whether you see aggregation around a couple models, or if on the contrary, you see them expressing discontent and leaving and going to another platform, right? So it seems that competition agencies could deploy that in the space. Machine learning here applied to more behavioral data may actually enable you to measure what's the behavior of users within the ecosystem to, again, try to these, right? Because if indeed you can have a model that is 10,000 times smaller and still be considered by users to be good enough for them to be used, that is a much different story than if you say, well, you can have a model that is twice as small, but still it would mean that it will require you a very large model and huge compute capacity. This is something that, again, can be measured. And the very last one is the scraping of the APIs. So some of those models are open access. What it means is that they give you the code, you could just take it and use it on your computer. This can't be tracked very easily. Some other models, such as GPT-5, are not open access, but what they say is that if you want, you can plug their model to your business, to your competition agency through an API. And this is something that will actually lead very often to public data. What will be very interesting is to measure the APIs and how many times they are being called upon by specific players in the industry. Now, the caveats to using all of those tools are twofold. First, here you focus very much on what can be measured, which I think is great. The downside of it, and George Akerlof, a Nobel economist, actually wrote a paper, which I love, published a couple years ago. He calls that the sin of omission of economic theory. By focusing solely on what can be measured, you are missing the elements that cannot be measured. And there is one that we cannot measure perfectly, and that's innovation, right? There is no coherent theory of innovation in economic theory, which means that there is no perfect way to capture how innovative is a company or a country. However, there are proxies that you can use, and many of them, but those are imperfect. So this is something to keep in mind. The second caveat relates to all the legal issues that would come with competition agencies using those tools, and maybe surprisingly, the legal standard for competition agencies is actually much higher than it is for the companies. I'll give you just one example. If you use any of those techniques to investigate a practice that may be criminal in nature, so it does not necessarily have to lead to a criminal sanction, but if it is something that may be criminal in nature, such as in many countries in the EU, public procurement, then the use of AI, according to the AI Act, is considered to be high risk, and you have to comply with the provision 9 to 15. Good luck with that and generating the technical documentation, right? So it creates kind of a perverse effect for competition agencies where you basically tell them, because of the AI Act, that they should deploy all of that to the less important practices, the ones that can never be criminal in nature. However, for the very important ones, we're going to put a burden on you that will probably discourage most of the competition agencies. This is something to be considered, because if it is not, well, of course, the company will see that as the entry door to challenge the decision, not even on the substance of the decision, but simply on the use of AI for the purpose of detecting the practice, quantifying the practice, or designing the remedies. So those are the two caveats, and yet I think that despite all of that, we're going to have no choice but to move to those technical analysis. And I'm aware that just before the lunch break was probably a bit burdensome, but if we do not, I think competition agencies will be constantly lagging behind. Now, the good news is that I see the expertise of competition agency being very strong in the space. I actually had the pleasure of receiving you on the podcast, and we actually discussed that, asking if a competition agency had now this capacity. I understand how it's not problematic when it comes to procedural fairness facing OpenAI and Google, because they also have this capacity. But what about facing a small company with no AI capacity? You could see already how this could be challenging for the company to understand what the agencies has been doing with VAR or machine learning. So those are great questions for lawyers and economists, which means that more conferences to be organized, papers to be written, and lunch break to attend. On that, I'll stop. I don't think we have the time for a Q&A, but I'll be around. So if you have any questions or comments, I'll be very pleased to hear from you. Thank you very much.